Been asked to tell this story 100 times. Politicians asked me. Generals asked me. Journalists from 17 different star systems sent me messages, some of them polite, some of them not. A Caltharian documentary crew camped outside my retirement quarters for 11 days straight, which I found both flattering and deeply exhausting. I kept saying no. Not because I didn't want people to know what happened, but because every time I tried to explain it, what really happened, not the sanitized version that ended up in the Galactic Council's incident reports, I could feel them already deciding the shape of the story before I finished a single sentence. They had a version in their heads, something clean and triumphant. Something that fit on a wall somewhere with a nice light shining on it. That's not what it was. What it actually was terrifying and ugly and small in the way that real things always are before they become legendary. It happened in a classroom. It smelled like recycled air and chalk dust. 3 of my students were crying before the first shot was fired, and not because they were scared of the soldiers. They were crying because I just handed back mid-cycle examinations, and Porvin Leseth had failed his 3rd consecutive assessment. That's where this begins, not in some grand theater of galactic conflict. In a classroom on a Tuesday. Let me set the scene properly. VOS 7 Orbital Academy sits in the upper ring of the VOS 7 station, which itself hangs in the gravitational shadow of the gas giant Velmun, roughly 42 light minutes from the nearest inhabited planet in the Confederation cluster. If you've never been there, the station looks, from the outside, like someone dropped a city onto a spinning disk and forgot to finish the edges. Half the structure is ancient, original Confederation construction from the early settlement era. All those brutalist alloy panels and exposed conduit, and the kind of functional ugliness that only becomes beautiful when you've looked at it long enough. The other half is newer, sleek. Built during the expansion years when the Galactic Council decided that centralized education was the best way to homogenize the cluster and reduce interspecies conflict. The theory being, I suppose, that if you make everyone sit in the same rooms and read the same books, they'll stop trying to kill each other. An optimistic theory, as theories go. The Academy's student population at the time of the incident numbered around 4,000, drawn from 31 different species and home systems. We had Caltharians, whose bioluminescent skin patterns shifted with their moods, which made exam days visually spectacular. We had Drenovath exchange students, all 3 of them perpetually miserable about the food options. We had Sulk twins from the binary system of Harethas. They moved like mirror images of each other and finished each other's sentences, which was charming until they started doing it during oral examinations. We had a scattering of Huvari, who were technically adults by their species standards, but looked approximately 11 years old by everyone else's, which caused constant confusion with Academy security. And we had humans. We had 17 human students that cycle, which was, by Academy standards, a lot. The human enrollment had been climbing steadily for about 6 years, partly because humanity had recently achieved full Confederation membership, and partly because human teenagers seemed genuinely enthusiastic about leaving their home planet and doing things that were, by any reasonable metric, quite dangerous. The Academy had made some accommodations. We'd upgraded the atmospheric processing in certain corridors because humans, apparently, found some of the nitrogen-heavy blends that other species preferred to be deeply unpleasant. We'd adjusted the cafeteria hours because humans were the only species in the cluster who genuinely wanted to eat something called breakfast, at a specific time, each morning regardless of what shift they'd been assigned. Minor things. The kind of accommodations you make when a new member joins the community. What we had not quite figured out, and I say this as someone who had been teaching in interspecies academic environments for 31 years, was how to properly contextualize human students for their classmates. The problem wasn't that the humans were difficult. They weren't mostly. A few of them were loud in the way that young beings from any species tend to be loud. One of them, a kid named Dirk something. I could never pronounce his last name correctly, and he always laughed when I tried, had the habit of arriving to class with approximately 7 different snack items, and consuming all of them during lectures in a way that I found distracting, and the Caltharians found genuinely offensive. But the actual underlying problem that I was only beginning to understand that cycle, was that the other students didn't quite know what to make of them. The Galactic Council's official position on humans, the position that had filtered down through every diplomatic channel and educational briefing document I'd read, was that they were a mid-tier civilization, promising, resourceful, somewhat impulsive, not particularly dangerous, good at certain kinds of creative problem-solving, not so good at long-range strategic thinking. The kind of species you'd recruit for your exploration crew if you needed someone who could improvise under pressure, but not the kind you'd put in charge of anything sensitive. That was the assessment. I'd read it. I'd accepted it in the casual way you accept things you haven't thought carefully about, and it had shaped, in ways I wasn't even aware of, how I and my colleagues treated the human students. Not badly, I want to be clear about that, not with malice. Just with a certain quiet condescension that I am, sitting here now at 78 cycles old with a glass of something warm in my hand, deeply ashamed of. The class I was teaching that Tuesday was called Principles of Galactic Civilization, a survey course, required for all second cycle students. 14 weeks of history, political theory, diplomatic framework, and what I privately thought of as the mythology of cooperation, the stories the Confederation told about itself to justify its existence. I taught it well. I'd been teaching it for 20 years. I knew the material the way you know a route you've walked 10,000 times, every turn, every loose panel underfoot, every place where the light was bad. That day's lesson was on the Vethali's Accords, the peace treaty that had ended the cluster wars 60 years prior, a document of extraordinary diplomatic achievement, drafted over 11 years of negotiations, and signed by 42 species representatives in a ceremony that had been broadcast across the entire Confederation network. I loved this lesson. I loved it because it was one of those moments in history where the story had a good ending, where beings from wildly different backgrounds had managed to set down their weapons and sign their names and agree, genuinely agree, that cooperation was worth the effort. I was in the middle of describing the signing ceremony, the Hall of Accord on Persevan Station, the way the atmospheric engineers had spent 3 weeks calibrating the air in that room so that every species present could breathe comfortably. The 42 pens, different instruments for different physiologies, laid out in a row along the signing table. I was describing how Arbiter Consul Henneth Drav had looked when she signed. The expression on her face, that specific kind of exhausted, complicated relief that comes when something enormous is finally finished. And then the alarms went off. Let me tell you what Academy alarms sound like, because it matters. They're not like the alarms in the old human entertainment programs, not that sharp, screaming siren sound. They're something the Council's psychological teams designed to be maximally cross-species in their urgency, without being maximally cross-species in their panic induction. A low, rhythmic pulse, descending in tone, repeating every 4 seconds, something that registers across most known species hearing ranges as attention required rather than run for your life. The distinction matters in theory. In practice, when that sound fills a classroom where 43 students are sitting in various postures of Tuesday afternoon academic fatigue, every single one of them goes rigid in about the same way. I had heard Academy alarms before: fire, atmospheric breach in a lower corridor, a lab accident in the chemistry wing that I was still not entirely cleared to discuss publicly. The alarm was an inconvenience. Protocol was clear: Remain in your classroom, confirm your attendance register, wait for instruction from station command. So that's what I did. I held up both hands, an instinctive gesture, I realize, deeply human in its construction, but the students understood it and said, "All right, everyone stay seated. This is most likely a drill or a minor." The wall exploded. Not metaphorically, not dramatically in the way that word is used sometimes. The actual exterior wall of Classroom 14B on the upper ring of VOS 7 Orbital Academy ceased to exist as a contiguous structural element. One moment it was there, a beige-gray panel of composite alloy with a maintenance notice about repainting still attached to the lower left corner. And then there was a sound that I can only describe as the station flinching. And then there was light and debris, and a rush of air that knocked 3 students off their chairs. The emergency seals activated within seconds. Blast panels dropped across the breach. The lights shifted to emergency red, and through the still settling dust, through the ringing in my ears that would persist for 4 days, I became aware of 2 things simultaneously. The first was that the alarm I'd been hearing was not a drill. The second was that the shape visible through the breach in my classroom wall before the blast panels came down, that angular, armored silhouette against the stars, was the prow of an Ondrath warship. I'm going to have to give you some context here, because if you're young enough not to remember the Ondrath reclamation conflict, you may not fully understand what I'm about to tell you. The Ondrath were a Confederation member species, had been for 40 years. They were large, significantly larger than most member species, bipedal, covered in a dense natural plating that served as something between skin and armor, with sensory organs that functioned differently from most oxygen atmosphere species. They communicated through a combination of subsonic vibration and chemical signal that the translation technology handled reasonably well, but never perfectly. They were also deeply, historically, legitimately aggrieved. The Confederation had absorbed their home system during the expansion period in what the Council's official documents called an integration. What the Ondrath called it was different. Their word for it didn't translate cleanly, but the closest approximation in common Galactic was something like the swallowing, which gives you a sense of how they experienced it. For 40 years they'd tried diplomatic channels, petitions to the Council, formal complaints, informal complaints, cultural lobbying. 3 separate referendums that the Council had honored in the breach, while publicly celebrating the spirit of self-determination. And then, 6 months before the Tuesday I'm describing, a faction within the Ondrath political structure, not their government, not officially, but a faction with enough resources to run a small fleet, had apparently decided that the diplomatic approach had run its course. What was happening, as I would piece together in the hours and days following the classroom incident, was the opening phase of what would become known as the Ondrath reclamation conflict, a coordinated series of strikes against Confederation stations and installations across the cluster. Not a full war in the classical sense, not an organized military campaign with declared objectives and formal declarations of hostilities. Something messier, something more like a desperation move. The Academy was one of 17 targets struck in the first hours. Whether that was strategic, Confederation installations, highly visible, multiple species of students as leverage, or whether someone in the Ondrath faction command had specifically chosen an educational institution for ideological reasons, I still don't know. The post-conflict tribunals were not entirely conclusive on that point. What I know is that they hit us, and that 12 soldiers in Ondrath combat plating came through the upper ring of the Academy within 6 minutes of the first strike. 4 of those soldiers came to Classroom 14B. I need to tell you what those 4 soldiers looked like when they came through the emergency door, because Ondrath combat plating doesn't quite capture it. Ondrath are approximately 2.5 meters tall on average. Their natural plating, in a non-combat state, has a kind of muted gray-blue iridescence that many species find genuinely beautiful. In full combat configuration, which involves additional external plating locked over the natural, heat dispersion arrays active, tactical visors engaged. They look like something that was specifically designed to walk through walls and make everyone on the other side of those walls immediately reassess their life choices. They carried Ondrath pulse disruption weapons, which operated on a frequency that interfered with the neural signaling of most oxygen atmosphere species and caused anything from severe disorientation to unconsciousness depending on the exposure level. Non-lethal in controlled doses, not particularly controlled in a chaotic station seizure scenario. The 4 soldiers came through the door in formation. They moved with the efficiency of beings who had rehearsed this. They covered the corners. They swept the room with weapons raised. They established, within about 15 seconds, complete physical control of Classroom 14B. Then the one at the front, the squad leader, I assumed, based on the additional marking on the chest plating, spoke. The translation came through with a half-second delay, which is always slightly disorienting. What the soldier said was, "No one moves. You are now under the protection of the Ondrath Reclamation Authority. Your cooperation ensures your safety. Your resistance ensures nothing good." That last phrase, "ensures nothing good," I always suspected was a translation artifact, but it landed in that moment with considerable weight. 43 students, 4 armed soldiers. I was standing at the front of the room with a presentation display still showing a historical image of the Vethali's Accord signing ceremony behind me, which, if you had any sense of irony at all, was genuinely painful. I raised my hand slowly. I kept my voice as level as I could manage. "Everyone stay calm," I said. "Do what they say." The first 20 minutes were the worst. Not because of anything the soldiers did specifically. They were, in a grim kind of way, professional. They didn't hurt anyone. They moved students away from the emergency exit. They confiscated communication devices, which in 2447 meant the small Neuralink tabs that most students kept tucked behind their ears, not some dramatic collection of physical hardware. They secured the door. The worst part was the silence. 43 students, most of them between 16 and 20 cycles old by their respective species' developmental standards, sitting in rows, trying very hard not to make eye contact with 4 beings who could physically end any of them without significant effort. Some of them were crying quietly. The Caltharians' bioluminescence had shifted to the deep violet gray that indicated extreme fear. The Drenavath students had pulled their membranes in close, which is their species' equivalent of making themselves small. The Huvari were holding hands. The Sulk twins were pressed shoulder to shoulder, doing the thing they did where they were clearly communicating in some frequency below what anyone else could hear. I watched my students and I felt something I am not entirely able to name. A combination of professional responsibility and raw terror, and a kind of grief. The grief of someone who has spent their career in a room that was supposed to be safe, and is now discovering, in the most unambiguous way possible, that no room is entirely safe. And then the soldier near the door shifted, and I saw her. Marin Solis, sitting in the 3rd row, 4 seats from the left aisle. 17 years old by human reckoning. 2nd cycle student. Had transferred to the academy from a colony called Harrow 9 that I had, at the time, only the vaguest awareness of, because it wasn't a particularly notable colony and human colonies in general were not yet on the Confederation's diplomatic radar in any significant way. Marin was quiet in the way that some students are quiet, not withdrawn, not shy, but contained. Like she had decided at some point that most of what went on around her didn't quite require her full engagement, and so she allocated her attention carefully and with purpose. She got excellent marks in my class, Not because she was particularly fascinated by Confederation political theory, I always suspected, but because she approached it the way she appeared to approach everything. Systematically, without wasted motion, with the specific kind of patience that looks like patience, but is actually something more like predatory focus. I had noticed her 3 cycles in, because she had asked me a question after class about the Vethali's Accords that I'd found genuinely interesting. Not the kind of questions students usually asked, the clarifying questions about what would be on the examination, or the engaged student questions about historical context that followed the lines I'd laid out. It was a sideways question. A question about what the Accords had specifically not addressed and why, and whether the absence of certain provisions was strategic or negligent. It had taken me 3 days to formulate a satisfying answer. She was, in retrospect, exactly the kind of student I should have paid more attention to. Right now, sitting in her 3rd row seat with an armed Ondrath soldier 3 meters behind her, Marin Solis was watching the room, not with the wide-eyed, frozen expression of fear that I could see on most of her classmates' faces, with the still, measuring quality of someone who is doing something specific, something internal, something that required her full attention and was producing absolutely nothing visible on the outside. She was assessing. I know that now. I could see it happening. I simply did not have the framework to understand what I was looking at. The soldiers had been in the room for perhaps 25 minutes when the second communication came through. One of them, the one stationed near the back of the room, received a signal through whatever system they were using to maintain contact with the larger operation. There was a brief subsonic exchange that the translation tech caught partially, something about a delay in the upper corridor, something about a change in position needed. The squad leader responded. The content didn't fully translate, but the effect was clear. One of the 4 soldiers left the room. 3 remained, still more than enough. Still absolutely not a situation where anything was possible, from a purely tactical standpoint. But Marin Solis' eyes had moved. I saw it happen. The slight adjustment of her focus, tracking the departing soldier, measuring the new geometry of the room, then tracking to the emergency door and its panel, which one of the remaining soldiers was now standing slightly further from than before. Then her eyes came to mine. And I want to be precise about this, because people have asked me and I've tried to be precise every time. She didn't give me a look that said, "Help me," or "What do we do?" or "I'm scared." She gave me a look that said, very plainly, "Stay calm and don't react to what's about to happen." I am 61 years old. I've been teaching for 31 of those years. I have never in my life received a look from a student that conveyed more information in less time. And I have never, before or since, felt a more powerful combination of confusion and instinctive trust. I need to tell you about HFY 9 before I continue. I said I had only the vaguest awareness of it at the time. That's true. Here's what I know now. HFY 9 is a colony world in the outer margin of the human settlement zone. A Class 3 designation, which in Confederation categorization means high gravity, variable atmospheric composition, significant indigenous megafauna, challenging growing conditions, limited infrastructure, high rate of settler attrition in the first decade of occupation. In everyday language, a hard place. A place that people went to because there was land and the Confederation hadn't claimed it yet, and they were willing to trade comfort for independence. A place that did not have academy-level educational facilities or council diplomatic support, or the kind of carefully maintained station atmosphere that allowed 17 different species to coexist without respiratory complications. What HFY 9 had was gravity that ran about 1.3 standard, a day that was 29 hours long, an ecology that included several creatures the colonists had categorized as hostile by default, which is the polite settler terminology for animals that would kill you if you wandered too far from the settlement perimeter without equipment and training. Marin Salis had grown up on Harrow 9. She had arrived at the academy. I found her intake records afterward, when I was trying to understand what I'd witnessed, with academic scores in the 90th percentile for her cohort and a physical conditioning assessment that the Academy's intake medical team had flagged as exceptional, verify methodology. They hadn't found a methodology error. She was just, by the standards of the assessment tools the Academy used, which were calibrated for a kind of species average baseline, significantly beyond what was expected. This is the thing about Deathworld colonists, and yes, that's what the Confederation technical classification calls colonies like Harrow 9, though the term hadn't yet entered common use in the way it would after the incident I'm describing. The assessments weren't wrong. She was 17. She'd been through the same schooling as anyone else. She wasn't superhuman in any science fiction sense of that word. She was just someone who had grown up in a place that made very specific demands on human beings, and whose body and mind had, over 17 years, adapted to meeting those demands. Her bone density was higher than the Academy norm. Her reaction times were in a category the assessment tool labeled Verify Equipment Calibration. Her proprioceptive awareness, the internal sense of where her body was in space, which had been measured during the standard intake physical, because the Academy had an obstacle course fitness requirement, was listed in her file with a small asterisk, and a note that said student appears to have significant background in physical navigation training, and then a question mark, because whoever wrote that note wasn't sure what to make of it. What she actually had was 17 years of walking Harrow 9's terrain, which did not have the luxury of being predictable or forgiving. What she had was a childhood spent learning that the world was hazardous, and that the appropriate response to a hazardous world was competence, not paralysis. I didn't know any of this in classroom 14B. I just knew what her eyes had told me. And I stayed calm, and I didn't react, and I watched. What happened next took approximately 11 seconds. I know the duration because the classroom's emergency systems had continued to log everything, and the recordings were reviewed exhaustively afterward, and the timestamp data was precise. 11 seconds. The soldier nearest the emergency door had shifted to look at something on the external panel. A notification from the station system, I learned later, an automated fire suppression alert triggered by whatever had caused the wall breach. A distraction, a small one, 2 seconds, maybe 3, of divided attention. That was the window. Marin Salis moved out of her chair. I want to try to describe this accurately, because the recording and the memory and the way I've heard it described by other people in that room don't entirely align, which is, I've come to understand, how it usually goes with things that happen very fast. Everyone sees it through the filter of what they were focused on and what they were prepared to perceive. What I saw was, she came out of her seat low, not standing up in the normal way but dropping below the desk level as she moved, which was not what anyone in that room was expecting, because it was not how beings normally moved out of chairs. She covered the distance to the soldier by the door in a lateral movement that I could not track cleanly because she was using the rows of desks as cover. Not hiding behind them, exactly, moving along them, staying below the sightline threshold, keeping the intervening furniture between her and the other 2 soldiers. The soldier at the door turned. He turned at the moment she came up from below, which meant she was already inside the range of the pulse weapon, already past the distance where it could be aimed and fired before she reached him. What she did next is something I have been asked to describe by 12 separate investigative bodies, and I have described it differently each time, because I am a political theory professor who has never in his life seen a human being use their body as a weapon, and I didn't have adequate vocabulary for it. The closest I can get is, She controlled the weapon arm first. Both hands, a rotation of her body that used her weight and the momentum she'd built in those 8 or 9 steps, redirecting the pulse weapon's barrel toward the wall rather than the room. That took maybe 2 seconds. The soldier was large. This should not have been possible. She was 163 centimeters tall and weighed, I later learned, 61 kilograms. But she had 1.3 g gravity in her bones. She had Hero 9 megafauna in her behavioral repertoire. She had, apparently, a very specific set of skills that none of us in that room had thought to ask about when we were categorizing her as a mid-tier civilization exchange student who ate breakfast at an inconvenient hour. The weapon discharged into the wall. The pulse hit the composite alloy and scattered, and every light fixture in the room flickered, and several students screamed, and the soldier was off balance. And Marin Salis was no longer where she had been. The next part is harder to reconstruct, not because of the speed, but because of what was happening simultaneously on the other side of the room. While I was watching Marin, while every eye in classroom 14B was fixed on what was unfolding near the emergency door, something else was happening. Derek, the student whose last name I couldn't pronounce, the one with the 7 snack items. I hadn't, until that moment, understood Derek either. He'd grown up on a different human colony, not a Deathworld designation, but a frontier settlement that had its own particular character. He was 6'2". He was broad in the way that people get when their adolescence involves manual labor and outdoor work, and the kind of physical activity that gym equipment simulates but doesn't quite replicate. He'd always seemed to me like a student who was slightly too large for a classroom. Not intellectually, he was sharp in his own lateral way, but physically, spatially, like he hadn't entirely adjusted to the scale of indoor academic life. He had been watching Marin. He had understood the look she'd given the room, I think, in a way that I had not read some signal in it that the non-human students also didn't catch, some frequency of human communication that bypassed translation tech. Because when she moved, he was already moving. Not toward the emergency door, in a different direction. Toward the soldier on the left side of the room, who had turned at the sound of the first weapon discharge and was bringing their pulse weapon up. And Derek, 73 kilograms of frontier colony human teenager, hit that soldier from the side with the full weight of his body, which was a move so tactically unsophisticated that I think it was precisely why it worked. Nothing about it was calculated. He just threw himself at a 2.5-meter armored soldier with the conviction of someone who had decided that the calculus of the situation had changed, and that the correct response to that change was immediate action. The soldier went sideways. Not down, they were too large for Derek to take down, but off balance, which moved their weapon arm away from the students. And that was enough. The third soldier, the one nearest the front of the room, nearest to me, had been covering the students closest to the door. When the weapon discharge happened, when the screaming started, when Derek hit the second soldier in that chaos, in that fractured half-second of every attention in the room being pulled in 3 directions. A Keltharian student named Veeth, who I had known for 2 cycles and who I would have described without hesitation as the gentlest, most aesthetically oriented, most contemplatively inclined individual in the class, threw a desk. Just threw it. At the third soldier. A Keltharian adult in full physical engagement is substantially stronger than their appearance might suggest. They've evolved for a high-wind world, and what looks like delicacy in a calm environment is actually a high-density musculature designed for low-drag movement in atmospheric conditions that would strip most structures bare. Veeth was not a fighter. Veeth had never, I can say with confidence, thrown a piece of classroom furniture at a sentient being before in their life. But Veeth was also terrified, and fury and terror in many species produce some of the same chemical outputs. The desk connected with the third soldier's weapon arm. The weapon discharged upward into the ceiling, the lighting grid fractured, half the room went dark. And in the confusion, in the dark, in the noise, Marin Solis had the first soldier disarmed. I don't know exactly how. I could not see clearly enough. What I know is that the pulse weapon clattered across the floor somewhere to my left, and the soldier was against the wall, and Marin was standing in a specific posture, weight low, slightly turned, hands up in a guard position that looked like she'd been doing it her entire life, and the soldier was not moving. Not dead, not unconscious, just not moving. The look on the soldier's face, to the extent that an Ondrath face, behind combat plating and a tactical visor, could be read, was something I recognized despite my unfamiliarity with their expression system. It was the look of a being who has encountered something that was not in their operational parameters and is currently recalculating everything. The fourth soldier came back through the door 40 seconds later. I want you to understand the scene he walked back into. His 3 squadmates, one disarmed and against the wall with a human teenager standing in front of him in a guard stance, one off balance and grappling ineffectively with a human boy who was apparently made of stubbornness and frontier colony muscle, one sitting on the floor with a cracked visor, and a Keltharian student standing over him with a second desk raised, and a bioluminescence pattern that had shifted to a color I had never seen before and did not have a name for. The room of 43 students who had been frozen in terrified silence was now not exactly fighting back, but in the specific posture of beings who have collectively remembered that they outnumber the people threatening them. The fourth soldier stopped in the doorway. He looked at the room. He looked at Marin. She looked back at him. There was a long pause, 3-4 seconds that felt like a much longer unit of time. And then the fourth soldier put down his weapon. He placed it on the floor in the slow, deliberate, hands-visible way that is universally understood across species, as I am not doing this anymore. It's possible he was making a strategic assessment. It's possible the broader operation had already started to fracture Station Command, had been organizing a response. The other Ondrath forces in the Academy had been encountering more resistance than anticipated. The overall plan was unraveling. It's possible he received a communication in those 4 seconds that told him the situation had changed. But what I believe, based on what I saw in the instant before he put the weapon down, the single moment when his eyes were fixed on Marin and her eyes were fixed on him, is that he made a decision. That this particular calculation had come out in a direction he hadn't anticipated. That the classroom he'd walked into was not the classroom he thought he'd walked into. That the species assessment he'd been given, mid-tier, not particularly dangerous, was missing something. He put down the weapon. And Marin Solis breathed out. Part 2, what happened after? Station Command secured the upper ring within the following 90 minutes. The broader Ondrath operation had, as I later pieced together, gone significantly less smoothly than its planners had intended across all 17 targeted stations. Part of that was the Council's emergency response protocols, which were slower than ideal but eventually effective. Part of it was the Ondrath faction's own internal disagreements, which had surfaced under the pressure of actual execution. Part of it was whatever was happening in 17 other locations simultaneously, each of which apparently had its own version of things not going according to plan. Our situation, 4 armed soldiers, one disarmed by a 17-year-old girl from a colony most people in the galaxy couldn't locate on a star chart, was not unique in its category of things going wrong for the Ondrath operation. But it was, I was later told by a Confederation security debriefer with a complicated expression on his face, among the more notable examples. The students were evacuated through the lower corridor once the security team had confirmed the route was clear. The soldiers were taken into Confederation custody. I sat in the emergency medical station for about an hour while someone checked my hearing, which was still ringing from the wall breach, and tried to answer questions from 3 different people who were asking them at the same time. Marin Sali sat in a chair 6 meters from me during this process, drinking something from a container that someone had given her, answering questions from the security debriefer in a calm, precise, methodical way that I found myself eavesdropping on despite my own ongoing interview. She described what she'd done, in sequence, without drama, with the occasional pause to find the correct terminology, not the hesitation of someone trying to remember, but the pause of someone being careful about accuracy. When the security debriefer asked her where she'd learned to do what she'd done, she looked slightly puzzled by the question, as if it hadn't occurred to her that it required an explanation. "Harrow 9, she said. "You learn how to handle things when they come at you. You don't have a lot of options most of the time." The security debriefer wrote something down. Then he asked, and I could hear the careful diplomatic phrasing he was trying to apply to a question he didn't quite have the framework for, whether she'd known there was a risk she could have gotten herself or others hurt. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. But the alternative was letting them stay in control of the room for however long that lasted, and I didn't know how long that was going to be. And I didn't think waiting was the right move. "How did you assess that?" the debriefer asked. Another pause, not uncertainty, calculation. "The one who left," she said. "He left because something changed in their operation. That meant something was going wrong for them. Things going wrong for them was a windows close." She picked up the container and drank from it again. "So I used it," she said. "I'll tell you about the conversations I had afterward, not the official ones, the real ones." Veith came to my office 2 days later, knocked on my door with the precise, slightly formal knock they always used, waited for me to call them in, sat in the chair across from my desk with the careful posture that characterized all their movements. "I need to understand something," Veith said. I waited. "I've been in your class for 2 cycles, they said, "and we've read about the Vethali's Accords, and the establishment of the Council's Mutual Defense Framework, and the integration of species rights into Confederation law, and all of it is about how we found a better way. How we stopped being beings who used violence as a solution." "Yes," I said. "And Marin," Veith paused, "what Marin did, what I did, that was violence." "Yes," I said again. Veith's bioluminescence shifted through 2 or 3 colors. "I don't know how to think about that," they said finally. "I threw furniture at someone. I've been thinking about it for 2 days, and I can't decide if I'm proud of it or ashamed of it or both." I thought about that for a while, a long while, long enough that the light in my office shifted and the ventilation system cycled through one complete rotation. "I think," I said slowly, "that the Vethali's Accords exist because the cluster wars were real. The war didn't happen because beings were violent by nature. It happened because of accumulated failures, political, diplomatic, structural. And the Accords exist because beings decided to build something that made those failures less likely." Veith was watching me carefully. "What you did," I said, "and what Marin did, that wasn't a contradiction of what the Accords represent. It was the other side of the same thing. When the frameworks fail, when the systems break down and the soldiers come through the door, there's a question of who you are in that moment, what you do." "And what did I do?" Veith asked. "You protected your classmates," I said, "with what you had, which was a desk and a body and 30 cycles of a life that turned out to have more in it than you'd been given credit for." Veith sat with that for a moment. "That's not exactly what the council would say," they said finally. "No," I agreed, "it isn't." Derek came to see me too, though his visit was less formally philosophical. He knocked on the door, came in without being fully invited, which was entirely characteristic, sat down sideways in the chair with his legs over the armrest, which I had never in 31 years of office hours permitted, and which I said nothing about this time and said, So, are we in trouble? No, I said, you're not in trouble. Okay, he said, because I punched an Ondrath soldier, which I think technically violates the Student Code of Conduct section on non-academic physical conduct. I suspect, I said, that the Student Code of Conduct section on non-academic physical conduct was written with a different set of circumstances in mind. He grinned. It was an uncomplicated grin, the grin of someone who had not yet fully processed what had happened and was still operating in the simpler register of it worked out. She was already moving, he said. That's the thing, I didn't plan it. I saw her move and then, I don't know, I knew what she was doing and I just... He made a gesture with his hands, a gesture that meant something I didn't have a word for, the gesture of action that doesn't require deliberation. Yeah, he said. I looked at him sitting in my chair, this large, loud, snack-consuming student from a frontier colony who I had categorized without thinking too carefully about the categorization, and I said, "How did you know what she was doing?" He thought about it. Really thought, which was not his most common mode in academic settings. Don't know exactly, he said. Same instinct, maybe. Same thing you grow up with when you're from somewhere that makes you pay attention. He paused. Where she's from, they've got those big things, he said. The Harrow megafauna, I've read about them. We didn't have those where I grew up, but we had other stuff, different stuff. But the I don't know, the way you have to be ready, the way you read a situation, that's the same. He looked at me with the expression of someone who had just said something more insightful than he usually allowed himself to say, and was slightly embarrassed about it. Or maybe I'm just impulsive, he said. That's what my dad says. Your dad, I said, may not have the full picture. I went to find Marin on the third day after the incident. She wasn't in her room. I eventually located her in the observation lounge on the upper ring, the section of it that had been reopened after the breach was repaired and the structural assessment was completed. The window looked out over the gas giant Velman, which was doing what gas giants do, which is to say it was enormous and slow and covered in bands of color that shift in ways that look deliberate but aren't. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the window seat, knees up, a physical textbook in her hands, actual print, which very few students used. Reading with the focused, unhurried attention that characterized everything she did. I sat down nearby. After a moment she looked up. "Professor Quale," she said. "Are you all right?" I asked. She considered the question seriously, which I appreciated. She didn't say fine the way most students would. She actually considered it. "I think so," she said. "I had some trouble sleeping the first night, but I think that's normal." "It is," I said. We sat for a moment. The gas giant revolved. The station hummed. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Yes." "When you were sitting in that room, before you moved, what were you thinking?" She looked at the book in her hands, then out the window. "I was thinking about the geometry," she said, "where they were, what I could reach. Whether the angles worked, what would happen if they didn't." "And the risk," I asked, "to yourself, to the other students." She was quiet for a moment. "There was already risk," she said. "That's the thing people don't always understand. Risk isn't something you introduce by acting. It's already there. You're just deciding how to interact with it." I thought about that. "That sounds," I said carefully, "like something that took a long time to learn." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, something adjacent. "Harrow 9, she said, which was, I was coming to understand, her shorthand for a complete education. I nodded. "The Council's assessment," I said, "of humanity, mid-tier, not particularly dangerous. Did you know that?" She looked at me sideways. "I'd heard versions of it." "What did you think?" Another one of her precise pauses. "I thought they were looking at the wrong things," she said. "They assess technology, organization, political development, all of that, and those are real. Humans aren't the most technologically advanced species in the Confederation. We're not the most organized. We're definitely not the most politically sophisticated. A slight dryness in her voice on that last point. But they didn't assess the places where people actually live. They assessed capital worlds, Earth, the main colonies. Places with good infrastructure and long settlement histories. And not places like Harrow 9, I said. Not places like Harrow 9, she agreed. They didn't account for what the frontier does to people. What it builds, what it requires. She looked back out at the gas giant. You know what you don't learn in a well-maintained station, she said. You don't learn that danger has geometry. You don't learn that waiting is a choice, not a default. You don't learn that the thing coming at you is something you can engage with rather than just something that happens to you. She looked at her book. Harrow 9 teaches you that pretty early, she said. Or it doesn't, and then you don't stay on Harrow 9 very long. Part 3, The Long Echo. The Ondrath Reclamation Conflict, as it came to be called, lasted 14 months. I'm not going to spend a lot of this testimony on the political and military dimensions, because that's been covered exhaustively by people with far more expertise than me, and also because it's not what I was asked to talk about. What I was asked to talk about, what I've finally agreed to talk about, is the classroom, the 11 seconds, and what it meant. But I need to touch on the aftermath, because the aftermath is part of the meaning. The Confederation's response to the opening strikes was, initially, what you'd expect: condemnation, security escalation, emergency session of the Council. There was significant political pressure to respond to the Ondrath faction's actions with the kind of overwhelming force that would settle the matter quickly. That didn't happen, partly because of a broader diplomatic effort that I won't take credit for knowing the details of, and partly because the nature of the conflict. Not a declared war, not a governmental action, but a desperate faction move that much of the Ondrath population had not sanctioned, and some had actively opposed, made the overwhelming force approach both ethically complicated and strategically counterproductive. What did happen, eventually, was a negotiation, a genuinely difficult one, by all accounts. The Ondrath grievances that had been accumulating for 40 years were finally put on the table in a formal context that required actual response rather than diplomatic management. A revised integration framework was developed. It took 3 years and 11 months from the opening of negotiations to the signing of what would become the Harath Revision, named after the station where the final sessions were held, not because it was particularly significant, but because that's how these things get named. The faction responsible for the strikes was subject to accountability processes that I understand were complicated and contentious in their own right. The academy was repaired within 2 months. The wall of Classroom 14B was replaced with a composite alloy that the maintenance team assured me was significantly more robust than the original, which I noted in my incident report as being both appropriate and slightly belated. I went back to teaching Principles of Galactic Civilization, a survey course. Required for all second cycle students, 14 weeks. I changed the curriculum. Not dramatically, not in the way that would have required council approval or curriculum committee sign-off. Small changes, the kind that accumulate. I added a unit on frontier settlement history, human and non-human, on what conditions of genuine hardship, not historical hardship but ongoing, lived, daily hardship, due to the beings who navigate them. I added material on the epistemological limits of species assessment frameworks. I added a case study, anonymized, at the subject's request on Classroom 14B and what happened there. I stopped describing human civilization as mid-tier in my lectures. Not because the factual data points underlying that assessment had changed. Technology, organization, political development, those numbers were what they were. But because I had watched a 17-year-old girl from a colony The council didn't take seriously read the geometry of an armed occupation and act on it in 11 seconds, and I had understood, in a way I had not understood before, that mid-tier was a category error. You can't assess a species by averaging their most visible examples. You can't understand what human beings are by looking at Earth and the main colonies and the diplomatic delegations. You have to look at HFY 9. You have to look at the frontier. You have to look at what happens when a species with no particular physical advantages, and no particular technological advantages, and no particular organizational advantages, puts itself in the places that are most demanding of everything it has, and what it becomes in those places. That's not mid-tier. I'm not sure what to call it, but it's not that. Marin Salis completed her second cycle at the Academy with exceptional marks across all subjects. She went into Xeno-diplomatic track in her third cycle, which surprised some people and did not surprise me at all. Understanding how things work, reading the geometry of a situation, knowing when a window is open, those skills transfer. She is, at the time of this recording, a senior diplomatic attaché with the Confederation's Border Relations Office. I expect, though I have not spoken to her in some years, that she is very good at it. Derek, I eventually learned to pronounce his last name, Ostrovsky, which I was told is a human surname with Eastern European origins, though the distinction meant nothing to me at the time and doesn't mean a great deal more to me now, went into engineering. Civil engineering specifically, station design. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that he's been involved in the structural revision projects for several frontier stations, which strikes me as appropriate. He was always more interested in the physical reality of things than the theoretical framework. Veith went into philosophy, which surprised me at first and then didn't. The question they brought to my office, was it right, was it wrong, was it both, is not a question that resolves itself. It's a question that opens into other questions. Veith is, by all accounts, a formidable academic, which I could have told you the moment they threw that desk. The other students dispersed into the Confederation's wide possibilities, as students do. I have heard from some of them over the years. The HFY students sent a group message on the 5-cycle anniversary of the incident, which I received and was moved by and failed to answer promptly, which I regret. The Sulk twins went back to Harethas, and I understand at least one of them entered local governance. The Drenavath students, who remained perpetually aggrieved about the food throughout their entire enrollment, are apparently thriving. I find this pleasing. The soldier, the one who put down his weapon. I thought about him for a long time before including this in the testimony, because it felt like a detail that complicated the narrative in ways that people didn't always want their narratives complicated. His name, his designation in common translation, was Varath Anam Kale. I know this because he was among the Andrath personnel who chose to give testimony to the post-conflict tribunal rather than exercise their right to non-cooperation, and his testimony was among the material eventually made available to individuals who had been directly involved in the incident. He explained his decision to put down the weapon, in careful detail, the kind of careful detail that suggested he had been thinking about it for a while. He had looked at Marin Salis in that doorway and understood something. Not what she was. He didn't have a framework for HFY 9 any more than I had. Not her capabilities. He'd seen what had just happened with his squad mates, so he had some data on that. But what he understood, he said, was that the situation he'd walked into bore no relationship to the situation he'd been briefed on. He'd been told the academy was a soft target, students, academics, multiple species which would complicate any organized resistance, personnel not trained for conflict. A situation where control would be established quickly and maintained, without significant difficulty. What he'd walked back into was a classroom where 3 of his 4 squad mates had been neutralized by people he'd been told to think of as non-threats, and a human student was standing in a guard posture waiting to see what he did. I put the weapon down, he said in his tribunal testimony, because I understood that I had been given incorrect information about the situation. And if I had been given incorrect information about that situation, I needed to reconsider everything else I had been told. He paused in the testimony, the transcript shows, a long pause. It seemed, he said, like the appropriate response to evidence. I've read that line probably 50 times in the last several years. It is, in its way, the most concise statement of what good judgment looks like that I've ever encountered. And it came from a soldier who had participated in an armed assault on an educational institution. People are complicated. Situations are complicated. The line between a being who does a terrible thing and a being who makes a good decision in the moment when it matters, that line is not always where we expect it to be. I am 61 years old. I am a professor of galactic civilization. I taught the Vethali's Accords for 20 years. I still don't fully understand that line. But I think about it.